Oh, David dropped.
He pressed the wrong button.
Or the connection was not good enough to do it all.
My Zoom crashed, and I don't know. I think I need to restart the stream. I would not be surprised by that. No, maybe it's still live. We'll find out. So hopefully it's streaming still. It says it is. It says it's streaming still. So hopefully that's still working. All right. Well, here we'll see if it crashes the second time. Thank you very much, Zoom, for doing that to me and making my head go freaking out. But I'm here with Cameron Cowan and Jesse Hirsh. We're talking about journalism and where do we go from here, I guess is kind of what we're starting with. And Cameron and I kind of had a little debate that we can kind of pick up on now. Um, and we can maybe even revisit this as we get going. Cameron talked about the idea we should show a static video for 10 minutes. I don't even know how to do that. So I'm lucky it's working at all. So we're just gonna have to live with that. But Cameron and I, and you obviously, if you're listening to the replay, you'll hear all this. But um, Cameron and I sort of propose the idea that it's not working, right? That journalism is not achieving. If we're talking about it as a role of the fourth estate, we're trying to inform the public and make them informed citizens and good voters and that kind of thing. They're not listening. Like they're not listening to us. So what other roles?
So, what other roles, Cameron, should YouTube streamers play when their Zoom crashes? Well, this is the tricky part of doing live. Oh, and we're back.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, we could be back. We might not be back. It's hard to tell. Um, but because it looks like we're back, but I mean, I guess we'll find out. And everything says it's streaming, so all that's there. But yeah, so the question then is, A, am I wrong? Like I think Cameron, your response is, well, if that's not what we're doing, then how does the world work, right? And and B, if that is it, like what are these other roles journalists can take if it's not, um, if it's not informing the public and sort of taking this role as the fourth estate?
Well, I think there's two I think there's two problems here. One is we have who they're listening to are people that have no, in some cases, no relationship to the facts. Looking at you, OAN, and to lesser degree, Newsmax. Fox News in court said that their content is entertainment and should not in any way considered being news to get out of a lawsuit. And I'm kind of like, well, I mean, I've known that, but thank you so much for being honest. Thank you for saying it out loud. And when I tell that to some of my MAGA supporters, jaws drop, and I'm kind of like, they are not news. They themselves have admitted that. Quit treating it like that, and you wonder why I don't watch. Well, Gutfeld's the biggest late night show in the world. I could give a shit if Greg Gutfeld had more popularity than Johnny Carson. I still wouldn't watch because there's nothing of value there. And I think then that kind of gets into problem number two, which is what is our job if people are not listening? So one, they're listening to crazy people. That's the first problem. The second problem is that I think I do think there is a certain amount um of sort of the influencer that I think journalists are called upon to take. I had said 10 years ago if the newspapers wanted to save themselves, they would start celebritizing their writers so that people are not following a publication, they're following a person. And columnists had this for decades. David Brooks, all these different people. Columnists had developed these audiences. Syndicated columnists had to develop these audiences so papers would pick up their column and they would get paid more. And I was saying, yeah, great. Now do that for everybody, across the whole news sort of thing. And I think there were some weak attempts to do that with social media, and brands got a little scared and a little frightened, and some things happened, and it kind of scared them off of the idea. But it's quite obvious to everyone that if you want to have, real influence in this country and get people around to your ideas, the people who have people's rapt attention are a very different set of people than I think that we're used to. Especially depending on what demographic you want to talk to. I saw a tweet this morning about someone saying, I forget who it was going on Theo Vaughn, I don't remember, Bernie Sanders something. Someone was going on Theo Vaughn, and someone said, "I fear that if we want to get people around, these are the channels we're going to have to start going after." And they're not wrong. I think they're quite right, and I think perhaps maybe that's the nascent future that we're going into. Is this sort of influencer sort of thing. When we've talked about community journalism for years and years and years, and it never got off the ground. We've talked about, how to use, social media and these new platforms to kind of grow beyond, legacy media and all this sort of thing. And I think now, after all of these years, we're finally in a place where that's real. Now, unfortunately for those of us on the left, that energy did not gravitate in our direction. But then again, I'm not paid by Qatar or Russia, in the case of Tim Pool or any of these other people. So, because an Audi, some shake oil shake somewhere has not decided to cut me a check, that energy is not going in the leftward direction. It is going in a very rightward direction, and I think it's because they fulfilled a market need of people wanting to hear a point of view that they had in their heads that they were not hearing in public. And I think that discordance created the conditions for that. So I think maybe to your point, David, it's less about informing the public now, and it's really more about a race for the attention economy. Who can keep people's attention? Who can get ideas into people's heads, who kind of has the eyes and ears of people. This is kind of how in the late 19th, early 20th century, newspapers were. There was fierce, fierce competition between newspapers, especially in places like New York that had 5 or 6 daily newspapers, really big city, had 5 or 6 daily newspapers. And there were also smaller ethnic publications, regional publications, all this type of thing. I mean, and Hearst gave no chill. Even going back farther, Horace Greeley had no chill. And they would do, whatever. And oftentimes, especially in the case of Hearst, that influence gave them buttloads of political power, because they had the ear of the American people. And whatever they put out there, would quickly become public opinion. I think, given that right now our country is deciding to do the early 20th century all over again, because we didn't do it well enough the first time, including a Great Depression, that we may be getting back to that, where rather than this sort of centralized group of media people that really in are, kind of broadcasting out and informing the public, we're regressing to the mean. It's going to be dozens, maybe hundreds of small people with attention, and where the influencers go, where the online in social media conversation goes, so goes public opinion. And unfortunately, this oftentimes means that the discussions will take place with no shared referenced set of facts. And it will be entirely determinant on the personalities of the people involved and how well you can convince them of a certain point of view. That's going to be a very tough. I think for left-leaning people, that's going to be a very tough environment to get any traction in.
Well,
Sorry,
there's
that
a
was very
million.
long. I apologize.
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of stuff there I do want to kind of stick with and riff off of, but I want to get Jesse with a few thoughts on this. What do you have to what do you want to bring us, Jesse?
Well, I don't agree with the determinism of Cameron's vision, but I do agree with the kind of central pillars, and the first being attention, that we are in an attention economy. And if we are to engage in either informing or mobilizing or criticizing those in power, we do have to do so with the understanding of how to get attention. And influencers are who they are because they've developed expertise in understanding the algorithm, understanding what works, understanding how to get it to bring their content to a greater audience. Certainly, that there are a lot of media organizations who have studied that, who've tried to adopt that. There are less and less news media organizations and more entertainment organizations. But I think that deficit does need to be closed. I think there are a lot of independent journalists. There are a lot of journalist startup organizations who recognize this trade-off between needing to get attention and presenting your work, presenting your stories. But I think fundamentally there is a larger crisis here, which on the one hand is the collapse of institutional journalism, credible institutional journalism. I think the institutions that Cameron noted are the more popular ones, and they're definitely not credible. And the ones who used to be credible, like the New York Times, like the Washington Post, even to a lesser extent, NPR and PBS, they unfortunately, for reasons that we might lament, no longer have the credibility to, as Cameron kind of inferred, convene a diverse audience, convene a group of people who can talk about the same stories, use the same words, and have the same conversation about policy or about democracy or about political priorities. I personally don't believe it has to be an ideological situation. I think that there is room to have either new credible institutions or, to Cameron's other point, new credible individuals, like in the old sense of columnist, who can emerge, who can have credibility amongst people of diverse political ideology. I think that begins with a certain level of honesty and authenticity about being true to who you are. And that often means not being objective. For some people, it could mean objective, right? There are some people who their personality is such that they're just really fair people. But I think for everyone else, it is about a certain kind of vulnerability, a vulnerability about your biases, a vulnerability about your background. And we are seeing people, many of them, to Cameron's point, are influencers. But there are others who I would still call journalists who are achieving this. They are still, unfortunately, exceptions to the rule. But I think there's a potential there, because I think, as contentious as the word may be, inclusivity is the future of journalism, in which people recognize that they are speaking to a diverse audience of people who do not agree with them, and that they can present their material in a way that is not just preaching to the choir, but anticipate speaking to the people who may be yelling at them because of what they're offering. And again, I see people on the internet who are achieving that, still outliers, but I think the seeds of a democratic media future are there. The seeds of a future of journalism, a thriving future of journalism, is there. But there are institutions which I believe, quite frankly, are in the way. And that those institutions either need to adopt these new practices, or they need to retire. They need to find a new business to be in. And I think right now we're seeing it in the existential crisis, not just of democracy, but of the news media. I think journalism continues to thrive and be alive, but the news media as a business is certainly in an existential struggle.
I want to introduce kind of this idea of thinking about landscape in a new way, because I think that'll speak to a lot of the stuff we're already talking about. So a lot of these questions will kind of come out in this conversation. But I definitely want to, before I even do that, I want to just touch on a little bit. Like, I love the one thing you said about, well, I love a lot of stuff you said, but one of the things that really stood out that I think doesn't get said often is, this idea, we talk about nonpartisanship, and that you can often gets equated with sort of both sidesism. We talked about this a little bit before during the ramp up. And, like, I kind of am threading this needle between nonpartisan and pro-democracy, right? And you also touched on at that point this idea of authenticity too. And I think that's a huge part of it. We all have to say we're not objective. I mean, there is no such thing, right? We're going to bring whatever biases we bring. Now, we can certainly go in with an effort to not be polarizing isn't even the right word, but not be toxic about it, that kind of thing. We can also go in with, I'm going to try to understand the other side here as much as I can, but with my biases, if I even understand what my other side is, I'm just going to have those biases. I can't get rid of them. So I have to be authentic about it. And one of my challenges here is, like, if I'm going to say, well, here's where I stand, I can't even define it well because I'm sort of homeless, right? I'm not going to call myself a Democrat. I'm not going to call myself a Republican. The best thing I can do is, like, say independent, kinda, but then I vote this way more often than that way. But that doesn't mean I do it often with holding my nose, this kind of stuff. And I think that's more the norm. Like, we have this misperception that most people are somehow wearing these colors and they're lockstep with that party, particularly in our country where we have, you at least can enjoy in Canada that you've got more than one party you can kind of work with, and they have to form a coalition. Here we've got to kind of pick one or the other, and most of the time people are holding their nose and voting one way or the other. But with someone with sort of cross-cutting issues and cross-cutting ideologies, it's really a hard place to be. But that authenticity authenticity, I think, is important. You just can't say I'm objective. It just doesn't. It's not realistic. Like, you're bringing some biases to the table. But the other side I want to think about now in this landscape idea. So, we're headed into this landscape. If you think about what happened with the Washington Post and not being told to not endorse a candidate. You talk about the New York Times, who was not the New York Times, the LA Times, who was told to not endorse a candidate. The LA Times, who was told to not be so hard on Trump, whatever that means. You've got Bezos and his new mandate for what's supposed to be in editorial columns now, right? I don't even understand those two pillars very well, but it reads like coded language, for some weird stuff. And obviously editorial boards don't like being told here's these pillars you have to stay within or whatever either. So, as we look at these threats with these lawsuits, ABC paid out, other ones have paid out. Well, that sends a message to everybody else. We're already seeing censorship. So let's look at a self-censorship. So let's look at an environment where, like, for independent journalists, like if I even wanted to call myself that, but those of us that are putting things out, oftentimes for us to have some credibility, we need to cite some traditional source, right? Sort of say, well, where'd you get that from, right? So we want to cite the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or AP or Reuters. But if those places are no longer putting out any kind of critical content, we don't have a source that we can go to anymore other than these alternative sources, right? And what does that world look like? Like, how does somebody like me or you, like, build credibility around what? Like, is a citation of, Random Joe on Substack going to start to be more credible than citing the New York Times or citing the Wall Street Journal? What does that
It
world look
already
like?
is.
Yeah,
Right. What does that
it
world look
totally
like?
already is. It's
Yeah,
it's it's
we're already there.
disintermediated journalism. Like, we have to go to direct sources. And
Right.
social media enables that, to Cameron's point, that everyone now has a voice on social media, institutional officials and
But
random
what we
Joe.
don't have is like the journal. Sorry to just jump in, but I think this point's important. What the old school journalists or the ones that the larger publications have is they have the access that we don't have, right? Like if they call Senator so and so, they get a call back. We don't, right? No one's going to
But
call us back.
we don't need that access if the senator tweeted it. We
Well,
don't
that's
need
true.
that
Yeah.
access if the senator has used their own social media to put up their statement. You are correct that there is still a hierarchy of proximity to power, and that's where the current White House press corps, as flawed as it may be, does have a better position to question power. But we now have to do the actual work of journalism. We now have to do the kind of things that were more many hands made for a lighter load. But now we have to be doing this heavy work, because I think there's a context that you are alluding to that I want to point out, which is I think it is worth acknowledging that we are now in an authoritarian society. The nature of that authoritarian society we can debate, and the extent of that authoritarian society in contrast to democratic society is worth debating. But I think the primary characteristic of an authoritarian society, to your point about self-censorship, is A, identity is imposed from above, right? We don't get to say who we are anymore. There are people who are trying to tell us who we are. That is inherently authoritarian. And number two, we are afraid to be who we are, because we're worried that we are going to get repercussions for being ourselves, as weird and as crazy as I know I am, and I know most people are. And as journalists, as media makers, we have to start with the premise that we should not conform. We cannot conform to that principle. And we continue to have the right to say who we are, and we should be proud to do it in a way that no matter what the blowback, we can still be who we are. It's a lot of courage, but that is fundamentally what it means to be a journalist, right? Is that you're not in the middle of the battlefield saying, no, I'm American. No, I'm Canadian. No, I'm Viet Cong. No, you're there saying, I'm press, and I'm here to be press. And I think that is really important as a context, a cultural context for us to keep in mind.
Cameron?
Last night I was watching a movie on Amazon Prime, an excellent movie called Mr. Jones, and it was about this guy who really lived named Gareth Jones, and he was the first to report on the Soviet famine in 1934 in Ukraine. The Holodomor, Holodomor. And how it was interesting how much after going through getting to Ukraine, which was difficult, and seeing the famine firsthand and living in it for a bit, and eventually getting picked up by the Soviet government and promptly sent home, how much people did not want to believe him because it was politically inconvenient to do so. For multiple parties involved, it was inconvenient for the British to have had someone do that. It was inconvenient for American business interests that were heavily invested in the Soviet Union at the time, and it was inconvenient for the Soviets, obviously, who had done an excellent job of making sure word of a famine never got out. And and the story obviously was that the Soviet Union's industrialization came at the price of about 20 million Ukrainians who starved to death. Um, and so this and I was reminded of how in those environments how incredibly important our work is, but also how difficult it is to continue to speak truth to power. And Mr. Jones was eventually killed by a Soviet spy reporting in Inner Mongolia. He didn't know they were a spy. And the Soviet Union, he was on their blacklist and they dutifully marked him off. And I was thinking, how hard it can be to do all of that. And so, Jesse, when you're talking about, being who we are and putting ourselves out there and standing up for our principles and all this type of thing, um, I think that's very laudable. That would have earned a round of applause in my media studies class when I was in college. But I think times have changed. And one of the things that David was talking about with, the editorial board and change, all this type of thing, it's really the normalization of Trump. In 2017 to 2021, it was about resisting it and not normalizing it and making Trump a sore thumb on a fence. Now, this is the country we live in. And I myself have taken a lot of the vitriol sort of out of the reporting. And sometimes I use a tweet on the NewsHour to make a greater point. This week I was going to talk about some studies from the Cato Institute, which if you told me 10 years ago I would ever use the Cato Institute as something to report on, I would have laughed in your face. But welcome to the new America, where things have gotten so off track, I'm reporting favorably on something the Cato Institute wrote. And sort of thing. I mean, the reality is this is where we're at now. This is what people wanted. This is what they signed up for. Never mind that we have lost $1.7 trillion in stock market value as of today, the recording March 11th, 2025. Never us mind that we're probably going to get a recession this year, entirely orchestrated by the government, although I think a recession was coming anyway. We have a declaration of emergency on electricity because Canada's cut us off. The Canadian economy will probably be created because of tariffs and reduced trade flows and all this sort of thing. It's going to be a mess. It's going to be a mess. But the reality is this, and I've heard this over and over again every time I interview someone who is a Trump voter. And to a man, they have all said, "No, this is what we wanted." And so I think the problem with journalism as an institution is it always presented a certain elite, East Coast, upper middle class to wealthy point of view on pretty much everything. And I think the ordinary person um, stopped identifying with that at some point. And when other people who had a more, everyday sort of view, sort of thing, came along offering that, it spread like wildfire. I mean, let's remember, Joe Rogan, they listen to it in warehouses, they listen to it in semi trucks. Same thing with all these people. I mean, this is kind of because that's where that's at, and journalism and the news media had really left that audience behind. It was ripe for the picking, and plucked it has been. I always used to laugh. I had a buddy who worked in a warehouse, and he would play my show there, and that really got people twittering, which was funny. And really got people up in arms, but it was good for them. And so I mean, that's kind of where I think, where I think, the difficulty is. I think I think journalism has to learn how to re-engage with people, and I think that's where influencers can help, especially the big institutions, who are viewed as sort of corrupt and in on it and all this type of thing. And that goes back to the Iraq War. I mean, now their complicity in selling weapons of mass destruction. And even before
Well,
that, but
that goes back, yeah. That goes back way before that.
even before that, but I mean that I think was a turning point this century for a lot of people. We can go back farther to Iran Contra. That's all a discussion. But I
Right.
think for people kind of swimming in this mix, that was a kind of a turning point moment. I think. Despite giving him $1 billion in free press, the way some of the things that people said in 2016 about Trump was another turning point, sort of thing. Limiting to the conversation to the 21st century, sort of thing. That I think we're both turning points. We both kind of felt like those institutions had left them behind. That's where I think influencers could help, but that's also why I think influencers are thriving in this environment. And I think it's about that personal relationship. It's about reflecting, someone's point of view, no matter how mixed up it can be. I'm an Obama, Romney, Clinton voter. I only voted for Obama once because I didn't think his presidency was ever going that well, and I've been very, very critical of the Obama presidency. And so I think there's a lot of people out there who are looking for something that reflects a more populist view. And remember, one of the appeals of Trump is that he says what people are thinking and what they may themselves are too afraid, not anymore, but were at one time too afraid to say. And I think that's what people are looking out of journalism, out of information, all this type of thing. I posted in the newsletter last Saturday a discussion I had with my buddy who'd sent me this video of this guy with a puppet who was going and interviewing liberals at a protest, and those videos always go in one direction, is to make the protesters look like idiots. And this video executed that flawlessly. And I was talking about, and he was just kind of, I found it disturbing. I explained to him kind of what was happening here in the dynamic. And I said, yeah, these always work on the right, but the left never does this. It doesn't work. And I said, for the following reason, the left is not in on the joke. For the right, joking and humor and BS will be polite on David's show. And BS is a big part of the right wing narrative because they're in on the joke. They kind of understand what's funny, what's not, what's serious, what's not. And the left does not do that way. The left narratives do not work that way. And the left does not get the joke and is not in on the joke. And so oftentimes the left is reacting to right wing humor that has no basis in any seriousness. The corollary of all of that, and I promise this has a point, and it is this. Um, is that the right needs to take politics more seriously because to them all of this is one giant joke, and the left needs to learn a sense of humor. And I was kind of talking about this because I always talk about narratives. I talk about narratives a lot. And I that was kind of an interesting sort of thing of I think honestly we could heal a lot of political discourse in this country if the left learned to laugh and the right actually took this stuff seriously, understanding that real people's lives are affected by this because to them it's all a joke. Circling this back to journalism, I think that's one of the reasons why a Jon Stewart, a Stephen Colbert, a John Oliver are so popular and work so well is because they're funny, they use humor, it's kind of not serious sort of thing. And I think for those of us who do kind of the real work of journalism and all this type of thing, I think choosing what we react to, looking at things with less of a serious lens, perhaps, but also looking for the satire, the silliness, whatever have you, I think is important. And I think it can be a way to engage people as well. But the whole ecosystem is changing, and I think this new dynamic is not the cold, objective, never have an opinion of Walter Cronkite, Charlie Rose, Dan Rather, Peter Jennings. That's over. Now it is about your personality. It is about your point of view. It is about what you bring to the table. It is what you laugh about, all that sort of thing. And can you engage an audience with that? I think that could potentially be the future. My only complaint is I think that future is going to be information and facts poor, which means the audience may be large, but they will be poorly informed. And John Oliver instantly is the worst at that. You think John Oliver is smart until you watch something he talks about that you actually know about, and you realize, oh my God, this man doesn't have a clue. And so so that I mean, I think that's the future, but I think it's going to be a facts and information poor environment, which is not good for democracy.
So Ed in the YouTube chat says he agrees about the joke thing. Now I want to add a little perspective to that. One is there's a great book on this by Dana Young. called Irony and Outrage, which sort of talks about the different kinds of sense of humors between sort of liberals and conservatives, and
Yeah.
and the mocking of the one side, and the like the way people understand sarcasm or don't and stuff like that. So
Mm.
it's a good book on that topic. And when you said something that about how John Oliver, well, you mentioned John Oliver, John Stewart, I think a few others, why they work, or maybe it was Jimmy Fallon or something, why they work. I would argue they don't work. I mean, I think they're adding to the toxic division because every night those guys go on TV and bash half the country and then wonder why they're mad at media and Hollywood and stuff like that. So I'm not sure it does
Yeah.
work. But I want to go to one thing that I think has been a big sort of a theme that's driving a lot of this um, uh, is people are that the world is different. Like we have crossed over a Rubicon of some sort. We're not going back, and I think this is a problem that are this is it's the Democrats are struggling with this. Journalism is struggling with this. I think there's a lot of institutions struggling with this, and I know I think I sent you guys something about the There Will Be Blood article. I don't know if you got a chance to
Hmm.
read that. I don't necessarily agree with everything they're saying there, but I think this idea that we are not going back. I mean, I see too many pundits still thinking, and even academics and stuff that come on my show, and sort of like, well, our solution is just better civics education or something like that. Like, it's great. I'm all for that, but we're not going back. Like we're not going back to the world that we had, in November 2024, right? Things have changed, and journalism's not going back. So it's never going to look like it did before. It's never going to be the same. That's my sentiment on this. And also, there's a little bit of the rose-colored glasses. Like it never was actually the way you remember it either, right? It's that there's that aspect of it as well. But I think in terms of both journalism and in terms of democratic institutions, we are in new territory. It's a new battlefield or playing field, maybe is a better word than battlefield. It's got new rules, it's got new tactics, and I'm really frustrated by the pundits out there that still are kind of haven't acknowledged this, and of course by Democrats, which I have not acknowledged this. And when I say Democrats, what I'm really saying is like an opposition party. Like we have no strong opposition party right now. The Democrats are fumbling, like they don't know what to do. I mean, they got ping pong paddles. They don't seem to have a strategy. They are. If you look at protests that are beginning to happen, they're kind of all over the place. Like nobody knows what they're protesting or why. Or in business we talk about if your product serves if your product serves everyone in the world, your product serves no one, right? And if I reverse that to my protest is against everything, your protest is kind of against nothing because people could just go, I don't know what they're protesting. It doesn't mean anything. They're protesting everything. And so why should I care what they're protesting? Because they just protest everything, right? So, I mean, I think there's a bunch of problems like that in journalism, we're in a new world. And I think also just generally in democracy. So maybe you guys can, or maybe Jesse, you could jump in on that for a little bit and then I'll jump back to Cameron.
I mean, I think there. I keep coming back to context because for me, context is where we start to understand the big picture. To your point, I think there's a lot of folks, especially the punditry class, who their livelihood, their sense of self, depends upon the old world, to use your language, and there's no way that they are going to relinquish that short of complete catastrophe. I think the reason that the Trump Musk regime is in power is precisely because these are people who do not have a stake in the old world and are happy to see it go up in flames if it provides them with an opportunity to create that new world. I mean, Cameron's point about John Oliver is really the truth of all media, that the news is never precise, it is general. And when it covers something that it looks stupid. I mean, I had the same experience with the New York Times, that when they were reporting on the freedom convoy that occupied Ottawa during the lockdowns for 6 months, the New York Times reporting was so atrocious because I'm there, right? This is my community. And I think that effect has always been there. And it is part of the problem of the disintermediation, that no matter how skilled, no matter how professional, no matter how capable a journalist is, there is always going to be someone local who can correct them, who can give them a more accurate perspective. And I think that is part of the credibility crisis. But my point about I really don't feel we are assessing the authoritarianism that exists today is I had a lot of problem with Cameron's comments. And this is primarily because of the determinism that Cameron brings to his vision of the future. Unfortunately, I agree with a lot of your vision to the future, but I don't think it is as clear cut. I think we do not know what is going to happen, and there is lots of opportunities for things to go differently. And under no circumstances do I believe that Donald Trump has a mandate from people. I think the cultural elite, Cameron, that you converse with are a cultural elite, even if they are a Republican cultural elite. And I will assert, with backed by whatever empirical research is available, that the vast majority of Americans and Canadians do not care about politics, do not follow politics, and could not pass a civics test. And I do not fault them for this. This is their choice. But this does not mean that the governments we have, whether left wing or right wing, actually have sufficient mandates. In that, I think the decline of democracy has been glacial. It's been happening for a very long time, and we've only just now realized the extent to which our culture, to my criticism of my dear friend Cameron, that our culture is authoritarian. And we on the left, those on the right, are easily seduced by this authoritarian language. The most obvious is technological determinism, the idea that AI will be the future and this will be like, there's so many examples I can give to in which I could say, no, you have no reason to believe that. There is no scientific evidence to believe that. The only reason you're saying that is politics. And politics is just a social construction. It can change at any time. I say this as a Canadian who 6 months ago thought that I would be a Canadian for the rest of my life. And now I really don't think I'm going to be a Canadian for another couple of years. So things change. They change fast. And journalism has done a poor job of explaining these changes. And I think if journalism, to your point, David, wants to experience a resurgence, I think it has to give the narrative that you were describing, that we are in a new world, that this new world does not necessarily match the narratives, frames, and institutions that we still have, and that we need to have an adult conversation. And there aren't a lot of adults, so it will be an elite conversation on what kind of society we're currently living in, how we should describe it, and how we should go forward. The last thing I will say is, I didn't know the name Curtis Yarvin 6 months ago, but I am now reading his work. I do find him to be a very brilliant, demented intellectual who I do believe he has every right to share his ideas. But I, as a journalist, have already been translating his ideas to my audience, helping them understand some of the ideology driving the current change. And to me, that is the role of journalism. Right? To serve our communities, to help them understand the world. I am very fortunate enough that my journalist audience is so small that I know each and every one of them by their first and last name and deep-seated secrets. And that's kind of all I ever aspire to. And if I can serve that constituency well, I will be well-fed, well-housed, will have a successful career. We do not need mass popularity. We do not need to be influencers. We can be journalists to a very small group of people insofar as that group of people can feed us, keep us safe, give us shelter, and do all the things that we need to survive. I digress. Please.
Well, I do want to say that I think that you make one good point I want to stress there is that, when I'm talking about like things are different, that doesn't mean I know what they are or where they're going. My main point is, and I think we named our group chat, the only way only way out is through, right? I don't know what lies on the other side, and I don't think, like as you say, I'm with you on that. I don't think we know. I don't think we can be so deterministic about what this looks like. I only can tell you I know it's different. and it's not going to be the same. Whatever wherever we end up is not going to be the same, and we're in a new world. But yeah, I don't know where it goes from here. But all I know is we gotta go through, and we can't go back. And and this is, I think, something else we can touch on about democratic messaging is, part of the problem I think they suffered is, and they don't even realize it yet, is they are the establishment party trying to tell us how to go back. And I think people are saying, or to preserve, they want to preserve the status quo is kind of the, is the best message they have in some way. And I think a lot of people are saying this status quo isn't working for me. Like, I feel left behind. It's not working, and I want something new. And you're not giving me that, so I'm going over here. And I think this is something, again, we talk about not accepting the reality that we're in. I think a lot of the Democratic messaging is still thinking we're in a normal election cycle. Like, I've seen people literally say things like, well, we're at this point in the election cycle, so these are the things that you do at this point in an election cycle. Dude, you're not getting it. You're not, that world doesn't exist anymore. We're in a new world. Whatever you used to do at this point in your election cycle, this is not how it's going to work. And I think this is a big challenge, that, and I think the Democrat leadership is struggling with this. I think you've got multiple constituencies trying to drive this, and and I think they're going to have to figure out how to big tent, I guess, but also build a coalition of some sort. So anyway, they're struggling with that, and I'm just really frustrated that there's so much of this kind of looking back, and then they're wondering why nobody wants to go with them. It's like nobody wants what we already have, and again, I don't know what the new thing is, but I'm pretty sure it's not what we had, November of 2024, and I don't know what the new thing is. I want to make it as good as we can, but that's kind of the mission that we've got to figure out. What does the new thing look like that we can all live with and think it's better? Because and a 100% off their authoritarian world is not the world I want. I know that.
And sorry, I'll just quickly jump in, and Cameron, you're more than welcome to take it from there. I see this new world here. Like, it's not easy to find. They don't have marketers, but there are genuine individuals and people. A friend of mine, Jeremiah Patterson, the Jeremiah Patterson Show, young guy, he's doing the do. There's lots of people out there. They are just not necessarily part of institutions. They're not necessarily part of organizations. But I think the seeds of this new world are there. I agree with you, David. I don't know what's happening. I don't know where we're going, but I'm doing my best to figure it out. And that's where, while it feels like there's a lot of darkness, I see a lot of hope. I see a lot of effort. I see a lot of innovation. It's just not by the Democratic Party. It's not by MSNBC. It's not by the usual suspects. And you have to be curious. You have to be keen to find these people. Ed in the chat was saying, the news cannot and will not explain Curtis Yarvin. It's way over the head of the audience in sound bites. And that's where I say you don't need to consume news that is sound bites. There is news out there that is not sound bites. There is such a diversity of voices right now that the news consumer, the citizen who wishes to be informed, if they are willing to put the work in, they can find just about any kind of person practicing the news right now.
But I am going to get to Cameron, but I have to jump in with one quick thing. You can do it in sound bites somehow, and this is the place where Democratic and a lot of time left-leaning people are terrible. Everything's wonky and like 3 paragraphs long, and you lost me on the second set of math I had to do, right? This is something and whereas there's no equivalent to they're eating the cats and dogs, right? There has to be more like that, where you don't have to make up a story, but you have to be able to come up with something that people can relate to in an easy way. And I think there are ways to explain Curtis Yarvin. We just got to figure out what it is, and it kind of comes back to that what messages are we're going to coalesce around. So Cameron, I'm sorry that we've kind of been pushing you out for a little bit. So please jump in.
No, I'm going to start with a couple things. I'm going to work back to front. One,
And by the way, we're not going to cover Curtis Yarvin in detail today either.
no. But that problem is emblematic of something I'm going to talk about, and that's this, is that the news media has been here before. So in the late 70s, early 80s, news had never really made money, and it was kind of allowed to not make money, sort of thing.
Right. It was
News gets
funded by
corporatized. Disney
news
buys
was funded
ABC,
by,
GE buys
yeah.
NBC, CBS was independent, later gets bought by Viacom. Everything goes corporate. They're looking at the news media division bleeding money and being like, please figure out how to bring in some income. And that started the if it bleeds, it leads. That started the 30-second soundbite. That started the how much stuff can we pack into a half-hour broadcast. Kind of the news that we grew up with. That starts, and there's a great movie about this called Network, starring Faye Dunaway. That I have a podcast episode about where I go through the whole movie and everything. And it was about that, quick, easy, fast moving sort of thing. And that was dominant through the 80s. I would say it reached its zenith in the 90s, particularly around the Clinton impeachment, Monica Lewinsky, all that fun stuff, which was a great day for the news media in this country. And then I think it really kind of overreached in the early 2000s, and then two things happened. One, social media comes online, and two, the smartphone arrives, and that completely changes how we do reporting. So we've been here before, and I think that should give us hope. Um, I think it
Yeah,
should
but
give
we
us
didn't really
pause.
solve any of those problems.
I'm gonna hold that thought, David. Hold that thought. And so we can take solace in that we've been here before, and we have survived. However, I would say when it comes to Jesse talking about, how do we explain things in clips, and David talking about democratic messaging is too long, it's too wonky, and all this type of thing. Um, I would say it's very easy to say they're eating the cats, they're eating the dogs, or she's for they them, I'm for you. It's very easy to do those things and say those things when you're not actually based in facts and reality. That's one of the things that Trump does really well is he has a very loose relationship with the truth. If there's probably one problem with Democratic messaging, and I would say Bill Clinton was the last to really understand this, is that you need to know how to bullshit. You need to know how to take truth and make it short and simple. And is it nuanced? No. Is it really close to what's going on? Probably not. But does it sound good on television? You better believe it. Even Kennedy in 1960 figured out short, quippy things that looked good on TV was going to bury Richard Nixon, who was stuck in the Eisenhower administration where he'd been vice president and not familiar with how to do TV, and he hated doing TV. Um, Even by the time he won in 68, he still hated doing TV. Um, and so I think it's a very difficult, I think this is a very difficult thing. And I think as this is gonna sound weird, but I'm gonna say it. I think the future of politics is not about the truth. Let's just let that sit for a second. It's really about the vibe and the narrative. And
Well, yeah.
early Harris
So
campaign kind of understood this before the DNC consultants got hired and sucked all the energy out of the campaign. That first month or so, where Waltz was just running around the country calling Republicans weird and everything, and it was all vibes and everything, I think they kind of understood that, and it did very well.
wow.
Unfortunately, the DNC consultants came along and shut all of that down, and that was pretty much
So
the day that campaign died.
I don't
Um,
think they understood it. I'm agreeing with you 100%. I think they stumbled into it. And
I
I
would,
think
I
they
mean,
stumbled
by
into it in a
understanding it,
way.
yes, it was not a planned strategy. They happened to have found fire and
Yeah.
ran with it, sort of thing. And then the consultants came in and said, "No, you can't do this." And I think they probably said, "Yes, okay, we'll stop doing it," because they didn't know what they had. They didn't know that they had captured fire from the gods. And so, I think all I think is really about vibes. It's really about your own personal. This is what Trump does. Your own personal narrative, and whether how much it is or is not based in truth is increasingly irrelevant, because
So
people want to vibe with you. People want to hear the things that they want to hear from you, and they want to feel like you're on the same page with them. And I think Democratic candidates would do well to not open the New York Times and figure out what they need to talk about that day, but to just go out and just sort of vibe, because Trump doesn't do that, and just sort of vibe with people. The Democratic
I'm
Party and the
I'm
Democratic machine is not at all ready for this conversation at all, at any level. They don't know
Right.
what to do. And if anyone on in the DNC was hearing me right now, they would be on the floor crying and vomiting, possibly
so
simultaneously.
I don't know though. I'm jumping in A because I'm agreeing with you rather violently, and B I think we are at the crux of the matter in terms of the future of democracy, the future of journalism, which is truth, facts, right? And the traditional pillars that journalism relies upon are dead. Now, I'm
Yeah.
not saying that something won't come later that's better or different or whatever, but this is part of what David's point was of we are in a new world here. And Cameron, I think you just articulated it quite effectively that it is about narrative and vibes. It is not about facts and truth. And that is really difficult for people on the center and the left because their political morality and their intellectual arrogance depends upon there being such a thing as facts and truth, and there isn't. And this is where, as someone who is left wing, I would say that the world we are now in requires negotiation. It requires negotiating the vibe because everyone negotiates a vibe when they enter the space. Oh, the vibes ain't right. I'm out of here. Right. And we also have to negotiate meaning, i.e., truth, what the words mean, what the things mean. And because the left and the center have completely abdicated, said, I don't want to touch any of that. I want to rely upon what I think is the truth, what I think are facts. That to me is also how we slipped into authoritarianism because we allowed there to be a top-down imposition of truth and meaning when the reality, based on subjectivity, is we all negotiated on our own. And the example I love to give to people when they say, no, but Jesse, we need facts, is doctors used to say that it was a fact that cigarettes were healthy. Right? And there was a time when science would have thought, yes, burning oil and petroleum is good for the environment. Right? Science is dynamic. Meaning is dynamic. So I agree with you 100%. It is vibes and it is narrative. I think Jasmine Crockett gets it. I think AOC is starting to open up to it. I think the Democratic Party as a whole
I think
is in
Bernie.
denial.
I think Bernie gets it.
I don't know. I saw Bernie's response. I guess it wasn't the State of the Union. It was just a talk to both houses of Congress.
It was an address to a joint session of Congress.
Yeah, and I watched Bernie's response right after, and honestly, I thought Bernie's yesterday's man.
Well, I know
he's got the right.
At least he kind of knows that, but he's out there doing something with these little
He's working.
town halls or whatever that he's doing, and his messaging is something. At least it's a little bit more concrete. But and an example of this idea of vibes, I think is a kind of a simple one to maybe rip off of too, is like Trump says all this stuff, and like you say, is it 80% BS? Some pretty much you could statistically show there's a pretty high percent of BS, but people hear all that stuff, and what they hear is, he gets me. He's listening to me, and that's what they aren't getting from Democrats, right? They aren't getting the they know me vibe, they hear me vibe, right? And I think that's a place where journalists have the same problem, like you're saying. I mean, it comes across as coastal elites, talking down to you, and even when they're educating you, they're not really. And again, it's the trust thing. It's all this other stuff kind of boiled into it, but anyway, just that thought of like they regardless of how, even if you tell them it's 80% BS, they go, yeah, but he gets me.
I think that yes, and that I mean we back in the day we used to talk about it. Who are you going to vote for? The guy you can have a beer with. And they talked about that. My first election I constantly remember was Bill Clinton, Bob Dole, 1996, and the complaint was no one would have a beer with Bob Dole. And we had the same thing with Bush and Gore in 2000. No one wants to have a beer with Al Gore.
Which
John
they're
Kerry,
not wrong
2000,
about that.
and nor would I, and I'm a Democrat. No one wanted to have a beer with John Kerry. Again, I'm also a Democrat. I wouldn't want to have a beer with John Kerry, sort of thing. But you felt like you could have a beer with Obama. But you couldn't feel like you had a beer with Mitt Romney. There's a really great episode I have with my mom called 45 Years of Elections with My Mom. And we talk about everyone she's voted for from 1976 to the 2020, I think. That episode came out in 2022. And it was very interesting, because she's what I call the median Republican voter. She's white, she's wealthy, she lives in a suburb, she votes Republican. At the national level. Local is a little bit different, but that's who she tends to vote for nationally. I kind of asked her, I said, what do you think is about, different between candidates today and all this type of thing, and talking about why did you vote for Ronald Reagan in 1980? And she said, after all we had been through in the 70s and dealing with kind of all of this, the stuff and the stagflation, and she had gotten laid off like 3 times in 2 years, sort of thing. And she was young; she was 18 and 74, so this is like her early 20s in the late 70s. Which I'm kind of like, well, mom, I understand. I'm a millennial. I get you, sort of thing. Um, sort of thing. It was. She described it as like he understood what you were going through and was willing to do something about it. And I think that's a big part of Trump's appeal. And on Monday at the NewsHour, I did a story where someone was talking about small towns, and someone said the Democrats are never going to win until they're willing to fix small towns that are boarded up and dying and all this type of thing. And one of the replies was, the economy's moved on. The world has moved on. That's no longer sustainable. And I come from out west where there's lots of teeny tiny small towns, sort of thing. And kind of looping this all back around of how do you talk to people about something they see as a problem, and your solution is, yeah, and that's not sustainable anymore. Can we move? When are you going to move, sort of thing. And unfortunately, for Democrats, we come to that small town and say, what a charming town, what a lovely place. We're so sorry it's dying, but your industrial base is gone, the agriculture is gone, all this type of thing. You really should move to the bigger city a couple miles away and start over. Trump goes to that small town and says, we're bringing the mines back. We're bringing the wood cutting or whatever it is. I'm also from Seattle area. We're bringing the timber back. All this sort of thing. I mean, that Trump, whereas Democrats come and say, our solution is you got to move and do better over here and something else. Trump comes to town and says, yes, your small town is dying and it shouldn't. And I'm going to put in the places to do that sort of thing. All of these things are kind of microcosms of the same problem. So when I hear Jesse, you talk about, yeah, things are dynamic, and yes, and facts do change over time. Cigarettes when we used to be healthy. Doctors thought babies didn't feel pain until the 80s, which honestly explains some things from my childhood. But sort of thing. I mean, these things do shift and change over time, and I think one of the problems. And I love your point, Jesse, but I think honestly, that's part of the problem
Which?
is well-meaning leftists like us are saying, yeah, the world is changing, it's dynamic, things are moving on, all this
But
sort of
no,
thing.
stop.
And you have a lot of the country who's saying, yeah, that's true, but we do kind of want to go backwards and do things differently in a way that works for us and
I
keeps us where
gotta
we are and all this type of thing. So I
I
think it's
gotta
very
interrupt.
difficult for us to have these conversations when we're approaching the problem from two different
But you
pathways.
should.
And
This
that's where
is.
I think you have to stop,
But
we
you gotta
kind of
stop
have to let
using the
truth and
word.
facts go in favor of narrative and vibes.
But you gotta stop using the word "we" when talking about me, because I ain't American, right? Not yet, at least. And that's
Yes,
where
we haven't
I
annexed you yet.
took
That is true.
great offense at you inferring that I was on side with Democratic policies or Democratic approaches, because
Yeah.
I'm not. And what you just described in terms of the depressed town and the Republican and Democratic approach, obviously I reject both of them. And I 100% agree that the Democratic approach to the divide in America, the economic challenges of rural America, is what has enabled the Republicans to come to power. That the Democrats have been so incompetent at dealing with income disparity and so incompetent at
Well, wait,
dealing
I want to
with
say something
middle
though. It's
America.
not really
Let me finish
Republicans are
this
good
very
at it. They
briefly.
just are better at messaging it.
Agreed, they're better at lying, which was Cameron's point.
Well, I'm
And
not
I'm
using
Yes.
that much, but yeah.
suggesting that journalism or small d democracy has a solution, which is to give those towns a voice, because that's what doesn't happen, right? Is they don't actually get a voice in their future. They don't get a voice in their agency.
They're not
And
invited to
that
the table. Yeah.
Right. And that is how you get them out of being hijacked by Republicans and manipulated by Democrats. And I'm not saying third party. I earlier was saying let's get rid of the Democratic leadership, because that clearly is a big problem here.
No,
But
no, no, no argument there.
I actually think there are. So I'll say this briefly. And David, I recognize you want to jump in. I think for politics, but I also think for journalists, there's a lot of power in the methods of improvisation. And if you ever take a class in improvising, one of the key things is yes and, right? That no matter what the other person says, you got to keep the story going. Yes and. And I think politicians are so stuck in their party messaging that they can't improvise with yes and. The town says, our factory's closed and we're overwhelmed with fentanyl. What do we do? Yes, I acknowledge your problems. And let's talk about how we can do something about it, right? So there's ways in which politicians and journalists don't have to promise anything. They don't have to offer solutions, but they can validate, they can empathize, and then get into the solution, which many local communities have lots of ideas of what their solution should be, and no one's listening. Sorry, David, go ahead.
No, no, exactly, and I think I want to kind of circle back to this idea of vibes and narratives because Cameron's over here screaming, "You idiots! Stop using facts and start using narratives," and he's 100% right, right? I mean, even we've even brought up stuff like the PSAs and things like that, right? And in science, so, I want to say that I think facts do matter, but you don't break into facts until you've got connection with somebody, right? And so facts maybe still matter. I don't know if I'd go quite that far that facts don't matter at all, but facts are not helpful at all to establish a connection, to get this validation aspect going and that kind of thing, right? And we know this. Like there's a lot of research on conflict resolution. And yet we tend to just fall back to the same old way. We're just going to start spewing facts. And so and I think when you come to narrative, like you were talking about sort of the yes end, if you the South Park guys have a whole thing about this that to keep a narrative going, there's a but in there, right? It's like it's not this happened and that happened and that happened. And pretty soon your eyes is like, well, now I'm completely bored because you just keep doing another thing. But they talk about that it's got to be this happened, but this happened. So in other words, there was some kind of a conflict or a challenge to go forward. And so that's another part of these narratives, right? I think you can bring out like acknowledge the challenges and the steps along the way that are there, and that keeps people interested in this narrative too. So I think for a lot of us, even out here doing podcasts or whatever else we're doing, we've got to get better at it too, right? We've got to get better at just learning how to tell stories, bringing in our personal experiences, our personal viewpoints, and that narrative style to keep an audience listening. Because it doesn't do us any good if we talk. We've been going for about an hour. We talk for another 2 hours, and most people are tuning out after 5 minutes, right? So all of those things are so important. But I don't want to give up yet entirely on facts. But I'm 100% with the idea that narratives are the way to move forward. And I think political campaigns have got to figure this out. And I think like the way we save the country has got to figure this out, right? Or the way we save democracy has got to figure this out because maybe that's when I say like they aren't listening. It's because we're shouting facts from the rooftop, right? And we've got to do a better job than that. So maybe it comes on us that we've got to do better to bring these stories in. And even Ed's point that it's hard to tell the Curtis Yarvin story on a poster, on a protest poster. He was right about that. That is hard, right? But we've got to start doing better about those kinds of things so that you need the soundbite to kind of break into it. You need the poster to break into it. And then you need the stuff that you're just talking about, Jesse, where you've got to do this connection. You've got to do the validation that, even coming back to people saying, but Trump gets me, and I think that's a piece that's missing. If you talk about rural America, this is a place where, Democrats just, you can't send Chuck Schumer in to connect with somebody in freaking Iowa, right? They're going to be like, yeah, no, you can't send Nancy Pelosi to Iowa. You've got to have people like Walls, right? And other folks like that connecting with those people in those rural areas, right? So anyway, I don't know where we want to riff from there or how much longer we even want to go. What do you guys think? Where do you want to go from here?
I'm good ending only because it's past 6 here Eastern time, and it's coming up to
I,
dinner.
I want to put a well cap on all of that with rural America and everything. During the pandemic, I was in a really great podcast community of people who are from the South, like myself, Appalachia people, all this type of thing. And I got talking with a really great political organizer, who I will not name drop. And we were talking about, how to really activate all the little blue dots in the sea of red in rural America and how to give better voice to rural America and all this type of thing. And I think that's very important work. We didn't end up kind of moving forward with a PAC on that sort of thing. They got a job doing something else, and so it didn't work out. But I think there is, I think, that we talk a lot about, running the 50 state campaign, but I think that is going to be increasingly important. I think learning how to talk to different communities, not diverse communities, but different communities, urban, exurban, suburban, rural, all this type of thing. Um, is going to be very important. And I agree, you do have to have the right person for the right region. sort of thing. But I think, giving, kind of understanding, what different people are going through is quite important. And then, proposing the right solution to those problems. And I think that's where facts can help, but I think it has to be packaged the right way. So create your policy solution based in reality, but find a way to sell it. One of the great things about that phrase, "Make America Great Again," is that phrase can mean anything it needs
Right.
to whoever is hearing it. You can subscribe to it whatever you want it to be. And honestly, we haven't had, the Democrats hasn't had that since Yes We Can. I mean, it's been a long time since we've had. I mean, the last couple have been, Forward, Stronger Together was
But
Hillary. I mean, it does not have the same punch, does not work, and you can't apply a lot of meaning to it, sort of thing. So I would just say, of all of this, we have a messaging narrative vibes problem. I think that's where the future needs to be fixed. I agree with Jesse that I think journalism can definitely help with all of that. And I think that, yeah, I think the world has definitely changed, and we have to rethink about how we're doing this. I myself could probably make my own segments shorter and more for the common man, sort of thing, my own self. But yeah, I mean, I think I
I
think
mean,
we I think we have managed to drive ourselves into, oh yeah, maybe this is what this could look like for this new world.
I mean, going full circle and without being too facetious, "Make America Great Again," as jingoistic as it is an inclusive statement. Like, if you want to, you can see yourself in that phrase, "Make America Great Again."
That's
And
what
I
makes
think
it
that
magical. Yeah.
exactly, the same way that "Yes We Can," that's similar to your point. The ones that work are inclusive. I disagree, however, with the selling part. I think the paradox of late stage capitalism, to use that phrase, is we've all been saturated with selling. And I think we've reached a point, to go, Cameron, to your earlier point about the attention economy, we've gotten a point that when anyone tries to sell us something, we turn off. That we are so, as a human species, allergic to being sold, that the brilliance of "Make America Great Again" is it's not selling anything. It's trying to evoke something that already exists, nostalgia, and it's done in a way that allows anyone to join the cult, to join the movement. And I
Right.
think the problem that Democrats have been making is, on the one hand, they're trying to sell and no one wants to buy. And on the
Right.
other hand, they're doing it in a very elitist and arrogant vibe, right?
Yeah.
Which they may want to be part of, but everyone else is like, "Nah, man, the vibe's off. I'm out of here." So that's why I do think
Yeah.
inclusivity, in spite of the current militarization and opposition to it, is core to building these types of democratic movements. And I think the other side to that is you cannot sell. You, for lack of a better phrase, this is problematic, but you have to seduce, right? Your vibe has to be fun, right? Your vibe has to be welcoming. People have to want to be part of it. If you're selling it, they won't go. If it's welcome and it's inclusive, they'll want to be there. And if their friends can be there and their other friends can be there and they can all have a good time, I think that's crucial. And we're at the end, and I have to pee and I have to eat. But I do think it's worth pointing out that Black Lives Matter, that summer where Black Lives Matter really dominated the news, the headlines, that was the closest America has been to a real kind of a protest movement that didn't fully devolve into the kind of violence that other protest movements have, even though BLM did. And I think where BLM had a certain amount of inclusivity and had a certain amount of fun to be part of the vibe, like, it was remarkable how many young people across ethnicities were putting Black Lives Matter in their hashtag, or putting Black Lives Matter in their social media points, that we saw the glimpses of that, but it didn't make it all the way. And I think as we start to see social movements in the spring and summer, because we will, if they can be inclusive, if they can be fun, if they can have those vibes, I think we will start seeing the through, right? The new democratic society, the new political movement that we hope will not be jingoistic, not be chauvinistic, but be inclusive and focus on small d democracy. I still have that hope that it's there.
Well, Ed in the comments mentions our Dem consultants hearing any of this. That's a good point. And I'll
Right.
say about, I think one of the, I think, we had a conversation about this this weekend with my son, and we talked about like it's cathartic to see these, in France they bombed a bunch of Tesla cars, right? It's kind of cathartic to see that, right? But it's the wrong approach, and this was one place where BLM lost credibility once it got framed as a violent, bunch of violent protests. It gives them like, yeah, you have justification now to send in the cops or whatever, right? And I think if you look at some of these protests or some of these movements, like, you think of Solidarność or, the Solidarity, I can't say it in Polish, but the Solidarity campaign that went on, the thing is like that campaign gets like, if you just, read up about it, you got like a paragraph about this thing happened and then the Russians caved. It's like, oh no. Like people died. Like this went on for a dozen years or something, right? This didn't magically just happen overnight. It's almost like the fall of Rome gets one paragraph, right? This happened for centuries. Like this was going on for a long time. But that solidarity campaign, one of the things that really I think helped that succeed was it didn't turn violent, right? I mean, they walked by, the Stasi police or whatever, with a candle and not a gun, and they didn't throw rock. Not a single rock got thrown because that one rock would have been enough for the Stasi or
Right.
whoever to go after him, right? It would have given him justification. You have no, if Trump decides to activate the military or whatever, they will not have any moral ground to shoot a bunch of people just holding candles and walking peacefully.
But this
right?
is where this is where your point of we're not in that old world. I think that question of violence is no longer relevant for the sole reason that Trump is going to bring the violence.
But I'm
Even
saying they
if
won't.
you
We don't
had
want to get.
even
I'm saying, and you could be wrong on
and
this.
I
Maybe this is
and
another
I'm
show for another
and
day.
I'm suggesting that what you are articulating is the mentality of the old world, which I share. But I'm suggesting that in this new world, it doesn't matter how many Mother Teresas were in that march. Trump will choose violence. The people he pardoned on January 6th are going to choose violence. And again, I agree with you. We don't want to bait this. We don't want to bring this
I'm not
upon us
saying there won't
because
be blood.
Canadians are having this conversation right now. I can tell you that.
I'm not saying there won't be blood, but I'm saying you won't have the moral standing if you're also violent. That just makes it an escalation.
And I'm disagreeing. I'm saying that moral
I
standing
don't
will
think it
be
matters
impossible.
anymore.
Yeah, that moral standing will be impossible to create because the lies that come from the other side it's all Antifa's fault. It's always going to be all Antifa's fault. So
George
You can
Soros funded
simultaneously say it was a good thing.
protesters.
You can simultaneously say it was a good thing and it was Antifa's fault, right? And it still works.
But that's my point. I think, as Cameron's saying, we're past that. That the violence is so enthusiastically embraced by our opponents that there is no moral superiority anymore. Unfortunately, it's all messy.
And believe me, if there was, the Democratic Party would fall all over itself getting on top of it. Because no one loves to be morally superior than the Democratic Party. If there was one, and I think that's part of the problem that we've identified, to
Yeah.
Jesse's point. There's no moral high ground anymore. We're all in the muck. And that's why the Democratic Party and leftist politics is so lost. Why I've said
Well, they're
for
still
months, it's a
expecting decorum.
surrender. Yes, it's
Yeah.
a surrender. It's a retreat. We're only, not even 60 days in. It's a surrender and retreat because now, with no moral high ground to climb onto, with no facts to support them, all this type of thing, they don't know what to do. That's all they've had, and they just lost the only thing they had. And now they don't understand that, yeah, you do have to have it. As much as I hate everything about the whole make it fun and make it a vibe and have a good time, I find that disgusting and repugnant. You're not wrong. That is 110% what has to be done. And I think that is, again, what the Harris campaign had and lost because of the consultants that they accidentally fell into. And I think that's the future. I think there's also this need right now to have somebody out there already campaigning, already talking, already countering Trump in a shadow government way, like we had a parliament that we don't have in this country. Our system isn't set up for it. And I think That's why everyone's like, Jeffries is no, everyone keeps going to a Democrat leader trying to make Schumer can't do it, Jeffries can't do it, Bernie Sanders can kind of do it, but he's old. Crockett's kind of out there. I honestly, if I had 10 minutes with Kamala Harris, I would say, Miss Harris, you need to do two things. One, start a podcast like Gavin Newsom did. He clearly wants to run for president in 2028. And I said, two, announce you're running today. It doesn't matter if your campaign fails. It doesn't matter if they don't give you the nomination. Start the campaign today and be the aggrieved, angry, I got cheated by the system that Trump did. And I guarantee you, even if your name isn't on the ticket, a Democrat wins in 28 because everyone will be able to galvanize around it. And we can do to the Republicans what they spent 4 years doing to us. And I have seen that comment over and over and over again on social media. And if I had 10 minutes with her, I'd say that's what you're going to do. You're going to start a podcast and you are going to be the loudest, most angry Democrat in this country for the next 3.5 years.
I got the name. It's not Caller Daddy. It's Caller President.
Well, I'll finish with a couple of things, some thoughts on this. One is, I recently interviewed a gentleman whose family, escaped Germany. Part of his family escaped Germany. Part of his family did not. And, and he talks about how, you've got to fight this from the beginning. It's the classic poem. We all know the poem, right? When they came for so-and-so, I wasn't, a trade unionist or whatever. When they came for me, there's nobody left. And the point of that poem was you got to start from the beginning. Like the first time that you see a thing, you got to stay with it and fight it somehow and oppose it somehow. And one of the reasons for that is not because you'll be successful, but because not doing so sacrifices your soul. And it sends you down a spiraling path of now I'm guilty. I let that group, now I'm more guilty, I'm feeling worse, and it sends you down this spiral. So I'm putting a quote in the chat, and I'll read it because you guys may or may not be on the chat. This is from Sarah Kenzier, and what she talks about, the quote is, I'll just read it directly. If you find yourself willing to negotiate another's humanity, that is when they've won something real. That is when you'll have surrendered your soul. So I'm going to leave us with that quote from Sarah Kenzier. I put it in the chat. And and I think that's a good way to wrap up, unless you have any other comments you want to throw in.
Nope, that's perfect. Thank you.
Well, thank you guys. I don't know if we fixed journalism yet. I don't even know what direction to go in, but it was definitely fun. I enjoyed it. So I really appreciate folks jumping on. We had a pretty good turnout and folks hang around. That's always nice. So it was great to see some folks on the YouTube channel. I'm gonna, I think, do more of these. So yeah, we'll say goodbye and thank you guys so much, and we'll shut her down. But thanks again. And I think you have all my contact info. If you don't, I'm easy to find at outrageoverload.net. All my stuff is there, all the socials, email, all that good stuff. I always want to hear from people. Like, don't be shy. Send me a voicemail, send me a text, send me an email, do any of it. So thanks again, Jesse and Cameron. Thank you so much for joining us. David. I really appreciate it. We'll have to do this again.
Yep.
Take care.